Good. Okay. Hi, everybody. This is our fourth and final class on the history of the church. Hopefully we'll get into more detail down the road, but for right now we're going to finish our 4-week seminar on the history of the church. Today we're going to be talking about the Reformation, as well as all of the breakaway main parts that broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, as well as the Counter-Reformation for the Catholic Church, and the Church as it stands today after Vatican I and Vatican II. We'll just cover that at the end. But in the meantime, we're going to get going on the Reformation of the Church. So we're going to first of all review, last week we did the Crusades and Islam, so I want to go back to week 2 and kind of give just a real quick overview of that so we can understand where we're coming from in the timeline. So as far as the timeline is concerned, so we went over early Christianity, that was week 1. Then we went over the Great Schism, and from about 500 to 1500, right about this time. Then we backtracked again, and we went into the Islamic fight between Christianity and Islam, as well as the Crusades, and kind of identified why Islam is a false doctrine. And now what we're going to do is we're going to start right around the same time where we were at the end of the second week, which is the start of the Reformation. And we're going to go into all of these brackets that broke off, as well as where we're at with the Roman Catholic Church as well. Okay? So, without further ado, so as we started moving into the Reformation, we did have the dark ages of the church, where the church had total dominance of Christianity and the repression of all art, science, and progress that was not Christian in nature. That had a lot of people irritated with the church. Okay? The era became known as the Dark Ages because of the introduction of theocracy. So basically, governments all around Europe were now being based upon theocracy, very similar to what happened with Islam with Saudi Arabia, as we talked about last week. Okay? Many things that were going on during that period. We had social upheaval. We had inner wars between tribes within Europe. We had the Holy Roman Empire. We had the decline of the church's power itself. We had a strong passion for knowledge. We'll get into humanism in a bit. We did have the Western Papal Schism, where we had the papacy break off into the 3 sections that we talked about, and then eventually went to Avignon, France, and then Catherine of Siena convinced the Pope to go back to Rome, and then the seat of Peter has been in Rome ever since. We also had the rise of nationalism. We had tons of continental wars, as I stated, as well as a lot of national pride. So you had different areas of Europe very proud of their specific ethnicities, etc., and they weren't going to let anybody change what they wanted to believe, and they also had a lot of issues with the church trying to force themselves upon them. That became what was known as the Renaissance spirit, or the spirit of the age. As knowledge grew, fear decreased. Men thought less of worshiping the unknown and more of overcoming it. And every vital spirit was lifted up with a new confidence. They were still spiritual, but the barriers were broken down, and there was no bound to what man might do. Okay? So that's our overview. So now we get into the dawn of the Reformation era, which started about 1350 through about 1512. And those are specific dates, but once we go through, you'll see why those dates are important. So we had a spread of Renaissance humanism. Now, humanism is the spirit, basically, that it isn't necessarily a spiritual theology, but it gives you the ability to start questioning things. Humanism started spreading all the way across Europe. You had in the first week we talked about the fact that, like Galileo and others, they would look into things and they were questioning things, and the church immediately knocked them down. So there was a lot of dissension about that with a lot of scientific people, as well as people that were in the spiritual community. And what started happening is this started spreading across all of Europe. It spread into Italy. It also spread into the church itself. It spread into France, England, Germany, and Holland. The other thing that was major was the invention of the printing press in 1448 by John Gutenberg of Mainz, Germany. He lived from 1400 to 1468. In 1446, he invented the printing press. Now, because of the Crusades, we had open trade routes to actually bring more paper to Europe. Now, Europe prior to this, all of the monasteries and all the monastic spread, the monks did all of the writing. So you would have monks do a couple of pages a day, and they'd put all of the beautiful drawings and everything else and their calligraphy. But you had to be extremely wealthy to be able to have a Bible or any other kind of written text. And that's why families had firstborns become part of the monastery. They'd become monks or they'd become nuns so that they could be taught Latin and Greek and actually learn how to read and be able to acquire knowledge. Martin Luther, said printing is God's latest and best work to spread the true religion throughout the world. And here's an actual picture of the very first printing press from the 1400s. This was Gutenberg's first press, and it is still in Mainz, France, or Mainz, Germany, sorry. So now, because of what was going on, I gotta clean up this slide. It's probably not projecting very well, but the sacramental system of salvation basically said, Latin in sacramentum meaning a sign or symbol, a sign of grace conveyed to the sinner. The concept full of grace. I'm just stating these right away because when we start getting into the next slides, these terms will be used. So the treasury of merits, or the concept of full of grace. There were mortal sins and venial sins. We all know what those are, and they still are very much in the church. Now, as far as purgatory is concerned, we believe very much in purgatory, and the concept is purgatory is a temporal place or state between heaven and hell where punishment is suffered by those who die in the grace of God but who lack sufficient grace to enter his presence. Now, there were, and still are, indulgences. Indulgences are a length of punishment that can be reduced, a length of punishment in purgatory that can be reduced by receiving indulgences from the Pope. Okay? In modern day, an indulgence, you get a partial indulgence or a full indulgence if you do a partial rosary or a full rosary. That's considered an indulgence to this day. Okay? The defense of purgatory, and it's interesting because when we start getting into Martin Luther, one of the things that is a defense, and I'm going to read it to you, is 2 Maccabees 12:39-45, which is very interesting. By the way, this phone, when I was talking about Saudi Arabia last week, this phone was where I put my Bible, so they didn't catch me with a Bible in the country. So let me get to Maccabees. Second Maccabees, and it is 12, 39-45. So it says, "And the day followed that Judas came with his company to take away the bodies of those that were slain and to bury them with their kinsmen. And they found under their coats of the slain some of the donaries of the idols of Jamina, which the law forbade the Jews, so that all plain saw for the cause they were slain. Then they all blessed the judgment of the Lord, who had discovered the things that were hidden. And so, betaking themselves to prayers, they besought that the sin which had been committed might be forgotten." This is where you pray for the dead. "But the most valiant Judas exhorted the people to keep themselves from sin, for as much as they saw before their eyes what had happened because of the sins of those that were slain." And it basically says, "And because he considered that the ones who had fallen asleep with godliness had grace laid upon them, it is therefore holy and wholesome, though to pray for the dead, that they may be loosened from sins." So this is in the Old Testament. This is in Maccabees 2. We also have some other passages in Matthew as well as Corinthians that defend the concept of purgatory that the Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches believe in. Okay? But indulgences had widespread abuses at the time. As an example, when I talked about the Crusades last week, the Pope for the first Crusade stated that anybody who went and fought the Crusades would get an indulgence, that they would have their reward in heaven from the Pope. So that wasn't a paid indulgence, but what was starting to happen was indulgences were actually being sold. And we talked in, I believe it was the first week, that the Pope actually had indulgences paid for so they could finish St. Peter's Basilica at the time. And this was a denial of the priesthood of believer. So, another thing that was also making the church look extremely bad was things like the Spanish Inquisition. So you've got the church denying science, you've got the church denying certain art pieces because they're not Christian, etc. You also have the Spanish Inquisition, where anybody who was not Christian, was as a Jew or a pagan, would be tortured to acknowledge Christ. And the Inquisition was widely openly used torture to obtain evidence for a wide range of alleged charges, including heresy, witchcraft, and bigamy. So this definitely put a black eye on the church. So as we start going into the Reformation, which starts in 1513 and goes until about 1600, this is the late medieval Reformation, we start going into, as I was talking about, indulgences. From a sinner's perspective, the receipt, usually a purchase, from the church of absolution, depending on the degree, from the temporal suffering necessitated by sin. Sin was absolved by priests, must receive temporal penalty, and that penalty can be diminished by the application of grace from the treasury of merits. That was the grace that we were talking about in those terms. Works may include a visit to a holy place, repetition of assigned prayers. So as we were young and we'd go to confession, you would get a certain amount of prayers that you would have to say. Okay, we still have that, but that was a system of penance, and that's what was going on there. Performance of good works, helping people, the monetary gift to the church, or in some way a good deed is substitute for a sinful deed or attitude. And at the dawn of Reformation, Pope Leo X, as I said prior, revived the Jubilee indulgence, purporting to use all revenues to fight the Turks in the East and help sinners in the West. His actual program was to finish construction on the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome. So here is an actual photograph of one of those letters of indulgence. It's all in Latin, but it basically says this form is an absolution, and it's signed by the Pope. So in 1500, this is what Europe looked like. Remember we were talking about the Holy Roman Empire? So you had the Ottoman Empire here. And then, it's amazing to look at this map in 1500 because Lithuania is huge and now it's just this small little piece. Moscova, which is Moscow instead of Russia. You've got Poland, which is considerably smaller, Hungary, Austria. The Holy Roman Empire is all of the pink right there, going all the way down almost to Rome. Then you had the Papal States around Rome and Bologna. And then, my family's Sicilian, you have the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. It was the lower half of the boot from Naples all the way down, and it was also the island itself of Sicily. All of this was being fought over, and there was a lot of dissension, as I said, about what was going on with the Papal States, as well as the Holy Roman Empire, as well as indulgences, etc., etc., etc. And you had priests and monks starting to question the authority of the papacy. So Protestantism was a movement in Western Christianity whose adherents rejected the notion that divine authority is channeled through one particular human institution or person, such as the Roman Catholic Pope. So Protestants had a problem with the papacy. Protestants looked elsewhere for authority in their faith. The Bible only, the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament as a source and the norm of their teachings. Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox Christians also stressed the authority of the Bible, but they also looked to the tradition. Now, when we talked about the early church didn't even form the Bible until the mid-300s. So, but all of the writings were there, but they hadn't been formed into the Bible yet. And in the case of Catholics, Catholicism to the Pope as a source of authority. The first one formally to break away was Martin Luther, who was from 1483 to 1546. Now, Martin Luther, in his early life, he was born and raised Catholic. He actually joined the monastery and became a monk, and was basically a priest with full orders. He taught at the University of Wittenberg, and in 1510 he visited to Rome, and he converted formally to Catholicism and became a monk over his life. He converted to the monastic life, and he entered the monastery of Erfurt in the order of the Hermits of St. Augustine. And his explanation for his abrupt change of heart was the violent thunderstorm near his village that had terrified him in such a degree that he involuntarily vowed to become a monk if he survived. That had to be a pretty bad storm. But the Augustinian order had become divided into two factions in the second half of the 15th century. And the monastery Luther joined was part of a strict observant factor. 2 months after entering the monastery, Luther made his general confession and was admitted into the community as a novice. He became a doctor of theology at the time. He isn't obviously a doctor of the Catholic faith, but as he was in the monastery, he started questioning indulgences. And let me go, I got these kind of out of order. And Germany was in upheaval over Pope Leo's scheme to tax the Germans by the sale of indulgences. So he had a real problem with that, and he was agreeing with the population. On October 31st, Halloween, 1517, he posts a debate notice for All Saints' Day on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. His emphasis was the proper use of indulgences. Now, his first initial reason for doing this had nothing to do with breaking away with the church. He wanted to reform the church. He was a priest. He believed in transubstantiation. He believed in everything that a priest would normally. But he had a problem with indulgences and wanted things fixed. Pope Leo X and the Archbishop of Mainz, as well as the King of Spain and France, they all were very upset with him doing this, obviously, and he was called to Rome. At that point, he insisted on them changing things, and they refused, so he broke away. And at that point, he was considered a heretic. So Martin Luther actually became the beginning of Protestantism. One of the things he did that ended up being decided once again at the Council of Trent was he removed the 7 books of Maccabees 1 and 2. Now these are all Old Testament books. Maccabees 1 and 2, Judith, Tobit, Baruch, Sirach, and Wisdom. Now what's interesting about the books that he removed was it had a lot to do with purgatory. It had a lot to do with, Tobit's about the archangels. So he had a lot of things that he disagreed with the church. So he actually removed books and considered them apocrypha and removed them from the Bible. So if you get a King James Bible, none of these 7 books are in it. If you get an American Standard Bible, New American Standard Catholic Bible, they are in it, okay? The Douay-Rheims Bible also has these in there. But the thing is that as far as most of our Protestant Christian friends, they do not acknowledge this. In fact, I was in a Bible study years ago, and I had somebody say to me, why do you have 7 more books? And I was kind of being a smart aleck, and I said, why'd you remove them? Because they were always there, why'd you take them out? And the Council of Trent, when we get to that, you'll find that they made sure that they stayed in our Bible. So this is the castle in Wittenberg that he actually nailed his thesis on. This is the door he actually nailed it on. It's a Lutheran pilgrimage site. And the problem with Luther is he never had a chance of ever reconciling while he was alive, because he got into such a feud with the Pope. He actually started writing papers on the Pope being the Antichrist. So he never had a chance. I mean, once you start calling the Pope the Antichrist, I don't think you're going to get along with him, and he's not going to ask you back. So the last days overshadowed by Lutheran disunity. The Lutherans who followed him started breaking away, and we'll get into some of that. Luther grows increasingly bitter and harsh towards the end. He was a very capable intellect, but not a renowned scholar. He was an unparalleled communicator, but when he started getting bitter and harsh and started writing papers against the papacy, etc., everything started falling apart. Both no chance of reconciliation with the Roman Catholic Church and coming back into it, nor him being able to get a chance to reconcile himself. He was a courageous and capable leader as far as the Lutherans were concerned. But what is interesting is after he died, remember I said that he believed in transubstantiation. When he started going against the Pope, he started the practice of, we do transubstantiation, which means the Eucharist actually spiritually changes into the body of Christ. They believe in consubstantiation, which is basically, it's a representation of Christ. It isn't Christ manifest. So at that point, there was no reconciliation anymore. He failed to divest himself enough of his Roman heresy, so he never had a chance of getting back into the church. There was a point in time, but it was far after Luther's death, that the Lutherans were asked at the Council of Trent to please come and try to reconcile, but at that point they were so far separated they never even accepted going to the Council of Trent. Now, another person who was a Lutheran, and like I said, the Lutherans started to break apart themselves, was another priest by the name of Jean Calvin. He was French. He broke away and became a Lutheran, but he had a lot of issues. It's actually, I don't have it with me, but the 5 principles of Calvinism. These 5 principles are complete heresy to our beliefs. If you get my documents, I'll give you the 5 principles. But he started preaching in France, and the French wanted nothing to do with him. So he had to escape, and he went to Switzerland. And he started Calvinism in Switzerland. So his structure was based on the Apostles' Creed, knowledge of God, personal works of Christ, the Holy Spirit, and the church. However, it was his interpretations of those. He said basically, you could not, God could only save you. You couldn't come to be forgiven and find Christ. Christ already had determined whether you were going to be a follower or not. There's a lot of things. I'll give you a copy of all of the basic structure of the 5 principles that he said. But his main life contributions, without the 7 books, of course, he translated the Bible into French. Now you do have a printing press now. So now the masses can now have Bibles. You have them in German, you have them in French. You have them in Spanish, English. Many letters of counsel and encouragement. He was the leader and pastor at Geneva. He reformed Protestantism in Europe and beyond. John Calvin's, the things that came out of Calvinism were the Puritans. Let's see. There's several. Eventually, Calvinism theology was also widely accepted in the Baptists, the Unitarians, and the Calvinist Church of New England. And more recently, Protestant interest in the social implications of neo-orthodoxy and many things in American evangelical type religions are all influenced by John Calvin. He wrote a Second Helvetic Confession in 1556. Basically, this is where he got the 5 principles. He was at the University of Geneva. And I mean, some of his concepts, send me wood and I will send you back arrows. Some of the people that were leaders and that came out of it were William Farel. He is a Calvinist who lives out his ministry in Geneva as a preacher. Calvin has a hiatus in Strasbourg. He returns to Geneva, and he writes articles concerning the government of the church. He was a very faithful and expository preacher. However, he had a lot of issues with his belief system, and I have 2 full papers on John Calvin that I'll give you. I tend to give you a lot of information. It's to your discretion to read it, but you can get a lot of information on these people from my documents. He was the leader of the Reformed Protestantism in Europe and beyond. So that's Lutheranism and Calvinism. The next one is King Henry VIII. Now, King Henry VIII is quite a character. Now, King Henry VIII started his religion because he didn't want to stay married to his wife. And he was a very devoted Catholic for a long period of his life. And at 15 years of age, his brother died, and he was forced to marry his brother's widow once he was of age, Catherine of Aragon. Now, they were married for quite a long time. She was part of Spanish royalty, and she was a very devout Catholic woman. And he fell in love with a girl in the court, Anne Boleyn. And Anne Boleyn was the downfall of Henry VIII. He asked the Pope for an annulment, and there was no justification because Catherine was so devoted. He did not kill Catherine, but he divorced her without consent of the Pope, and made her finish her life in the convent. And then he said, fine, I'll start my own church. So he started what is known as the Church of England, and it's eventually become the Anglican Church. And in America, the Anglican Church is called the Episcopal Church. If you've ever been to either a Lutheran or a Episcopal service, all of the prayers are in the exact same place. It's very amazing. One of the things that King Henry VIII did, though, is he was so arrogant about starting his own religion, him becoming the head of his own religion. And by the way, the crown is still the head of the Church of England. So right now, Charles is the head of the Church of England. He was so arrogant about it. I don't believe it's More. I believe it's Mosley. Yeah. Cardinal Mosley said that Henry was so arrogant, he was even going to rewrite the Lord's Prayer. Now, this is very interesting because when we do the Lord's Prayer versus Protestants doing the Lord's Prayer, we end at deliver us from evil. Protestants we still have it in our Mass, it's called the doxology, and it says, "For thine," this is the way they say it, "For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, now and forever." So they don't finish the Our Father until they get done with that part. Well, the person who changed it was Henry VIII. He decided to add the doxology to the Lord's Prayer, and that became the Lord's Prayer. And that's part of Henry's arrogance. Okay? I always like little facts like that because those are the ones that stick with you. And by the way, if you've ever watched the series The Tudors, actually Mosley brings that up in the series about him being so arrogant that he rewrites the Lord's Prayer. So the separation of the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church was obviously by King Henry VIII, as I said, although he was declared then by the church a defender of the faith prior to him wanting a divorce. He wanted to push for separation because the church and the state, so that he may have full control over England. Now, you have to keep in mind, remember when I was talking about the monastery system and England taking control, and then England falls away from taking control and France takes control? That's part of the reason, because he was so enraged by the Catholic Church. He wanted all their stuff, he wanted all of their money, all of their vineyards, all of their property and everything else. So he took his military and went abbey by abbey and razed them to the ground and killed the monks and took all of their gold and prosperous things and their chalices and moved to the next one. And if you ever go to England, Scotland, or Wales, there's tons of ruins still. They're absolutely gorgeous, but they were all sacked by Henry VIII and his men. It is because he wanted to annul his marriage with Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn. Although he sought first the permission from the Pope, but Pope Clement VII refused him. As advised by Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, Henry VIII broke away from the church, then proclaimed himself supreme governor and of the Church of England. Real arrogant guy. Prior, he was a very ardent supporter of Rome. He came into conflict with Rome after he was refused the divorce. He created a Reformation Parliament. So this is when you started having the Wars of the Roses and everything else in England, because you had the Protestants and the Catholics fighting each other to the death because of the start of all of it with Henry VIII. Personally rewrote the Lord's Prayer, as I said. He made a book of common prayer, which established new liturgy. He did the 10 Articles Act of 1538, which bends away from Roman Catholic doctrine. He does the Act of Dissolution in 1539, which strips Rome from her English monasteries. Now they're his. And when the monks and all of the religious started objecting, like St. Thomas More, he sent them to the Tower and cut their heads off. He expelled Roman monks who operated those properties. 6 Articles Act of 1539, he reasserts some Roman Catholic doctrine. So that's why the Anglican or the Episcopal Church has a very similar service to a Roman Catholic Mass, because he reasserted some of the Roman Catholic doctrines back. Because he was a good Catholic. He just wanted another wife and decided he was all omnipotent. After that, he killed several more wives and all kinds of things, and he died a very, very terrible way at the end because of a jousting accident which never healed his entire life. So, the next thing is the Counter-Reformation. This is from right around the same time, 1513 to 1600. So while Martin Luther was trying to break away, and then Calvin broke away, and everything else, we were trying to reunify by eventually having a council called the Council of Trent. By the way, I'm going to go over a couple other ones that were, before we get into this, I want to go back to the map of all of the items. So we went through Lutheranism, we went through Anglican or Episcopal Church of England, we went through Calvinism. We have two other ones called the Anabaptists and the Restorationism. So let me go over those real quickly, because there's so many variations to Christianity. Obviously, we're the root, but the thing is these are not apostolic. So when we talk about one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, you have the Eastern and Western rites, you have Eastern Orthodoxy, such as that are considered one holy Catholic and Apostolic. Even though they have their different things, they all go right back into the Roman Catholic, and they acknowledge the papacy as the head. These refuse the papacy completely, okay? So they are not apostolic. So Anabaptists. Anabaptists basically started in 1521, and they aimed at restoring what they claimed to have been primitive Christianity. They believed the absolute supremacy and sole sufficiency of Scripture as the norm of faith. So Scripture and Scripture alone. Infant baptism and the Lutheran doctrine, again, these are all that kind of spiraled away from the first breakaway, okay, which was Lutheranism. Infant baptism and Lutheran doctrine of justification by faith alone were rejected, and they were said they were without scriptural warrant. The new kingdom of God, as far as they were concerned, which they purported to have found, was to be the reconstruction on an entirely different basis, both ecclesiastical and civil society. Communism, including for some of them the community of women, was to be an underlying principle of the new state. Now, some of the things that came out of Anabaptism, as they started moving forward with this, they actually got into a lot of weird stuff. Nicholas Storch, he was a Lutheran preacher, and he was the one who first attacked infant baptism. Until his death at Munich, traveled through Germany, spreading doctrines, especially where he was one of the principal instigator of the peasant wars. In 1525, he came as a preacher and married a former nun. Henry Pfeiffer, an apostolic monk who became a co-laborer in Mulhausen, had prepared the ground for the new gospel. Pfeiffer became absolute masters of the city, flocked around them, pillaged and devastated the surrounding country. The insurgents were utterly defeated, and after the battle, Munster was discovered in bed in which he had hidden, was delivered up to an executioner. He received even though he broke away from the church, he ended up receiving the sacraments of the Catholic Church before his death in 1525. They got into the New Jerusalem, the founding of which was signaled by a reign of terror and undescribable orgies. Treasures of literature and art were destroyed. Communism, polygamy, and a community of women were introduced. And it was just a mess. After all of that was done, they ended up the fall of Munster and the determined repression of Anabaptists by Catholics, Lutheran alike, pronounced an ultimately complete elimination of the violent features of this movement. So Menno Simonis, a former Catholic priest, got rid of all of that craziness in the whole group and actually formed the Mennonites. So the Anabaptists actually became the Amish, okay? And they ended up moving away from Germany into Holland, and that's where the Mennonites came from. The Anabaptist teachings represent respecting infant baptism was adopted by the English and not accepting infant baptism was adopted by the English and American Baptists. So Baptists wait until you're of age and you can actually say, I want to be baptized. So that's the Anabaptists. Now the other one was the Restorationism. Now Restorationism, this part, came off of the Calvins, okay, the Calvinists. And part of their stuff, let me just get to what they came from. There's all kinds of things that came from them. One of them was the American Stone Campbell Restoration Movement, where it basically became evangelicals down in Tennessee and Kentucky. You had the Christadelphians from 1805 to 1871. Awareness caused him to devote his life to the study of the Bible, and he promoted interpretations of it which were at variance with mainstream Christian views that the Restoration movement, as well as all of the other Christian sects, believed in. Christadelphian movement emerged as a distinctive doctrine incorporating Adventism. This is Seventh-day Adventists eventually. Anti-Trinitarianism. They didn't believe in the Trinity. And the belief that God is a substantial and corporeal being. They object to military service, lay membership with full participation of all members. So out of them, you had the Adventism, which is the Seventh-day Adventists, the Worldwide Church of God, the Advent Christian Church, other groups that originated in the 19th century from Restorationism: Jehovah's Witness, Plymouth Brethren, Pentecostals. A lot of things broke in shards in this one. British New Church Movement, the Shepherding Movement, Apostolic Prophetic Movement, the Church of God, Iglesia in Cristo, and Jesuism, which is personal philosophy encompassing the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, commitment or adherence to those teachings. But far cry from Catholicism. So that's all of these that split off. So I just wanted to get into those last two because there's a lot of things that broke off of the main ones: Lutheranism, Anglicanism or Episcopal, and Calvinism. So, the Council of Trent. This one was the 19th council, and we only have two more, Vatican I and Vatican II after this. So between 1563 and Vatican I in the 1800s, that was the next council. This represented the true Reformation. Others called it the Counter-Reformation. It was convoked because of the situation created by Protestantism. Since Luther revolted in 1517, things went from bad to worse. As you can see, it all splintered up into multiple things. But it took 20 years for the church to convoke such a council. The significance of the council were it gave the complete list of books of the Bible, those 7 that Luther took out, and declared that tradition as well as Scripture are both sacred. Tradition with a capital T. It declared that God's grace and man's freedom had to cooperate in the process of salvation. Calvinists say God's grace alone, you have no free will. God's going to decide. We declared that God's grace and man's freedom had to cooperate in the process of salvation, and that nobody is predestined to eternally be damned or saved. That was another Calvinist thing that they're proving against, okay? True faith must be expressed in good works. So as far as Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, all of the orthodoxies, we consider faith and works an important thing that helps you to attain heaven. It decrees that the 7 sacraments were instituted by Christ himself, because a lot of the other churches that were breaking apart didn't even acknowledge that the sacraments were of any importance. The Eucharist is a memorial of the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, not only a commemoration of the Last Supper. So now you're getting into transubstantiation, consubstantiation. We're saying it's transubstantiation. It doesn't physically turn into flesh, but spiritually it is flesh. Additionally, to fight the clergy's ignorance, the council decided to establish diocesan seminaries. Prior to that, that wasn't the case. For their spiritual and cultural formation, preaching on Sundays and holidays was made obligatory. Up until that time, that was not the case. It also removed all of the abuses connected with indulgences. So you couldn't sell them anymore. That was one of the biggest things. Indulgences still exist to this day. They're valid. Luther just didn't want them to be sold, but it went far worse than that. Okay? It extorted cardinals and bishops to avoid luxury and to become models of holiness and humility. This has always been an issue. This has always been an issue even to this day, but it was trying to make sure that cardinals and bishops avoided luxury. It confirmed the existence of purgatory, which we already spoke about, and the legitimacy of the veneration of saints. That's one of the other things. That's one of the other things those 7 books did. You not only talked about purgatory in those 7 books, but you also, in Maccabees, as well as Ruth and Tobit and the other ones, they talk about the veneration of saints. So basically in the Old Testament, and this is where our belief in saints comes from, I'll just give you an example. If my mom passes away, I can pray for her and pray for her to make it to heaven. If we believe, let me give you the whole scenario here. I've had this conversation with Protestants all through my life. Well, you worship saints. No, we don't. This is the situation. Do you believe that you can pray for other people? The answer is yes. I can say, please pray for my son. Please pray for my friend who's sick. Please pray for, etc. Okay? Do I believe in life after death? Yes, I do. Okay? So if you have this conversation with Protestants, those are the first two things you ask them. Can you pray for me? Yes. Do you believe that you will go beyond your physical body? Yes, I believe that I will live after death. Okay. So if you can pray for me and you can live after death, why can't you pray for me once you're dead? So I'm not praying to St. Anthony. I am asking St. Anthony to pray for me. Or I am asking in the prayer to Mother Mary in the Rosary, I'm asking her to pray for me. That's a veneration of a saint. That isn't me praying to a saint or worshiping an idol, which a lot of Protestants think it is. It's me asking a saint to assist me by praying to God. That's all that is. Okay, so, and the validity of religious vows. So it confirmed the existence of purgatory, the legitimacy of the veneration of saints, and the validity of religious vows. So now we get into the modern era of the Catholic Church. Now, the First Vatican Council, which is the 20th council, was the first ecumenical council of the Vatican, or Vatican I. It was all of the other ones weren't at the Vatican. It was an ecumenical council of the Roman Catholic Church and opened under Pope Pius IX for 2 years. Two of the biggest things that came out of the First Vatican Council was the dogma of papal infallibility. This has been an issue with us and Protestants since Protestantism came, but they finally, we always believed in it, but we actually made the dogma of papal infallibility at that point. Now, infallibility, I mean, if you want to chime in, but basically, infallibility is on spiritual things, not material or governmental or anything else like that. Infallibility is only regarding spiritual things. The other thing that was always believed but was never made a dogma was the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. Basically, that Mary was conceived without sin and she is the Immaculate Conception. Now, the Roman Catholic Church has believed that for centuries, but we never actually made it a dogma until 1870. So, as we were saying, the veneration of saints, well, the greatest saint, of course, is Mother Mary. And the veneration of Mary, the Mother of God, the official title was bestowed in 431 at the Council of Ephesus. But again, there was no dogma about her. Mary was increasingly viewed as the mediator interceding with the Son for the mercy on sinners. In the 13th century, she was designated as the Queen of Heaven. And the Immaculate Conception, Mary born free of original sin, was declared by Pope Pius IX in 1854. As well about Mary, she is a perpetual virgin. Jesus' brothers are considered his cousins. There's a lot of thought that he could have had stepbrothers, but as far as we're concerned, we believe that the interpretation is that they were cousins. The Assumption of Mary, she was taken bodily into heaven. Pope Pius XII in 1950 basically made that an infallibility statement. Pope John Paul II referred to Mary as the co-redemptrix and co-operator in the redemption. That is not yet official, but St. John Paul mentioned both of those. Now, the Second Vatican Council. The Second Vatican Council happened in 1962 to 1965. It started with St. John the 23rd, Pope St. John the 23rd, and Blessed Paul the 6th. The Second Ecumenical Council of the Vatican, or Vatican II, was an ecumenical council of the Roman Catholic Church for 4 years and lasted through the two popes. The significance of this council, I mean, we've all grown up in it. I was born in '63, so when I was growing up, a lot of these things were changing, but we still had a lot of things that were left over from previous to Vatican II. First of all, it brings about an updating or a renewal that would enable the Church of the 20th century to address the problems of the 20th century. It gave greater recognition to the laity's role in the Church. When I was a kid, we did not have Eucharistic ministers like we have now. There wasn't a lot of readers. There's just a lot of things that weren't done by the laity. And just lots of changes as far as the lay people assisting. Even in when I went to Catholic school, you still had a lot of nuns, but you had lay teachers being brought in more and more into Catholic school, and so that freed up the nuns as well as the priests for other things. It gives way to a greater participation of local churches in decisions that would affect the church universally. So as an example, we've had changes in our church since Father Mike to the friars, changing crosses, moving tabernacles, stuff like that. That kind of stuff is at the discretion of the local church and the pastor. There's other things that have been, like with COVID. We've got situations. I just went to a funeral mass in the Archdiocese of Chicago, and they handle COVID completely different than we do. They actually have hand sanitizers at the point where you actually go up for communion. They will not let you take the mask off. You have to move to the side and then consume the host. So they've got all kinds of different things. But again, that comes down to the diocese itself. They decide those things. It affected most visibly the shift of the aspect of the liturgy. Big thing. Before Vatican II, the Mass was done in Latin, and the priest was facing the tabernacle, not the parishioners. That was a big thing. The faithful were also given the opportunity to participate more fully, actively, and consciously in the liturgy. So when I was a kid in the 70s, we had what we called the Kumbaya Mass. So we'd have a teacher who was a great guitarist, and we'd be singing and everything, and that's the way it kind of was in the 70s. But that was the kids and everything being able to get involved in the liturgy. We still do that today, but it's obviously changed by times and everything else. But that's what helped us because of Vatican II. So this one isn't going to go a full hour and a half, but I have all of the slides for all 4 weeks. I also have all of the documents that I've been referring to. I also have a complete printout of the main things that happen in all 20 councils that I will give to Teresa and Deacon Bob. And then any questions you have, if you forward them to Deacon Bob or Teresa, I'll be glad to answer. And hopefully if we have the need or want, we can go into some other topics. But for right now, that's it. So thank you very much for your time, and God bless, and have a great Christmas season.